Welcome to Echo No More, clear, credible, court-ready documentation in high-conflict parenting. No hype, no legal jargon, no drama. I'm Dr. James. If you're new here, I'm really glad you found this space. This podcast is for protective parents navigating high-conflict custody situations, especially when the other parent is manipulative, emotionally unsafe, or unpredictable. I'm not a lawyer, and this podcast isn't legal advice. What I am is a parent who has lived through this system, and someone whose attorneys over and over again told me the same thing. Your documentation is excellent. They told me it made their job easier. They told me it protected my credibility. And they told me it changed how my case was received. That's why I'm sharing this. Not to teach you how to fight, but how to document calmly, clearly, and in a way courts actually understand. This is parent to parent, calm, grounded, and focused on protecting your child without losing yourself. I want to start this episode by saying something that may surprise you. Most parents are not making documentation mistakes because they're careless. They're making them because they care deeply and because no one ever taught them how the system actually reads information. The mistakes we're going to talk about today are not character flaws. They are survival responses. And once you understand that, it becomes much easier to correct them without shame. The most common documentation mistake I see, and one I made myself, is using documentation as proof of pain instead of proof of pattern. When we are hurting, it's natural to want the record to reflect that hurt, to want someone reading it to feel what you've been living. But courts don't feel records, they analyze them. When documentation becomes a place to convey pain, it often becomes longer, more urgent, and more explanatory over time. That's when credibility quietly starts to erode. Not because the pain isn't real, but because the system isn't built to process it that way. Another very common mistake is explaining intent. So parents often write things like, "They did this to control me," or "This was clearly meant to punish the child," or "This was an attempt to undermine parenting time." Those interpretations may be accurate, but courts cannot work with motive unless it's explicitly proven. So when you write intent, you write the other side something easy to challenge. When you write behavior, you give the court something hard to dismiss. A related mistake is diagnosing or labeling, especially when it comes to the other parent or even the child. Using clinical terms, psychological language, or diagnostic labels can feel validating, but unless those terms come from qualified professionals in appropriate records, they often weaken your documentation. Courts are cautious around labels because labels imply conclusions. So observation, on the other hand, implies care. Another mistake that happens often and quietly is inconsistency. Not inconsistency in truth, but inconsistency in formatting, tone, or level of detail. When documentation shifts widely from entry to entry, it reads as reactive, even if content is factual. Consistency builds trust. It tells the reader, this parent documents the same way regardless of emotion. Another common mistake is documenting everything. We talked about this earlier, but it's worth repeating here because it shows up again and again. Over-documenting doesn't look protective to courts. It looks overwhelming, and overwhelmed readers don't see patterns, they see noise. Documenting selectively is not minimizing harm, it's preserving clarity. Another mistake many parents make is forgetting to close the loop. They document incidents but never outcomes. So the record reads like a series of unresolved crises. That doesn't mean the situation is unresolved. It means the documentation is incomplete. Outcome doesn't need to be dramatic. It just needs to exist. Another mistake is using documentation as emotional regulation. This one is especially common for trauma-exposed parents. When we write while activated, documentation becomes a place to discharge emotion. That's understandable, but it's costly. Documentation written in that state often requires later correction, explanation, or apology, and courts notice corrections. One of the hardest mistakes to let go of is believing you need to convince the record. You don't. You don't need your documentation to argue. You don't need it to persuade. You don't need it to defend you. You need it to exist calmly over time. That's enough. I want to pause here and say something very important. If you recognize yourself in these mistakes, it does not mean you've ruined your case. It means you're human. Most documentation mistakes are correctable, especially once you stop making them. Courts look at patterns over time. That includes patterns in your documentation. When your records become calmer, clearer, and more consistent, that shift itself becomes a part of your credibility. Another mistake parents worry about is not doing enough. They think, what if I stop documenting and something happens? What if this was important and I didn't record it? That fear keeps parents trapped in vigilance. Documentation is meant to support your life, not consume it. If documentation is costing you your peace, something needs to shift. And here's the reassuring truth. Strong documentation is rarely frantic. It's steady, it's boring, it's predictable. And that predictability is what makes it powerful. The parents whose documentation courts trust the most are not the ones who write the most. They are the ones whose records look the same month after month. Same tone, same structure, same restraint. That steadiness communicates safety, and safety is what courts prioritize. I want to end this episode today by reframing mistakes entirely. Mistakes are not failures, they are signals. They tell you where fear is driving the process instead of structure. Once you see that, correction becomes an act of self-protection, not self-criticism. You don't need to be perfect. You need to be consistent, calm, and willing to adjust. That's it. Before we close, I want to remind you of something important. You don't need to document everything. You don't need to be perfect. And you don't need to convince anyone with emotion. Calm documentation is power. If this episode helped you, you will find a full structured system in my guide, Clear, Credible, Court Ready. It's designed to support, not replace, your attorney. And if you want help turning everything you're documenting into something organized and usable, you can visit www.economocoaching.org to download my guide on how to create a clear, court-ready documentation binder. Take what helps, leave what doesn't, and most of all, take care of yourself. I'll see you next week.